Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Root Causes series. Happy Earth Day, Feliz Día de la Tierra. My name is Nancy Treviño with Presente.org and Alianza Americas. And as we get started, we want to let you know that this is part of our Root Causes series of discussions on the root causes of migration, with voices from leaders and allies in Central America, working on an array of issues such as economic inequalities, democratic governments, and the rule of law, climate change that we'll be discussing today, and other issues. This series is an effort to collectively build a deeper analysis on the root causes driving migration from Central America in recent decades, and what needs to change to address forced displacement in the region. Today, we will analyze climate change and its impact on human rights in the region, resulting in forced internal displacement and migration. Today, in celebration of Earth Day, we believe that it's important to reflect on the impact of climate change on human mobility. A deeper understanding of the impact of climate change in Central America will allow us to consider what possibilities there are for persons fleeing from climate change to find mitigation and adaptation strategies in their home countries. We believe that this specific topic should be part of this root causes conversation, and we're hopeful that today's conversation with our amazing guests serves that purpose. And before we introduce our panelists for this afternoon, we want to just give a shout out and a thank you to the other sponsors of these past 6 events, including Latin American Working Group, Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, OXFAM America, Presente.org, Casa Yurumein, ONECA, Centro Presente, CARECEN Washington DC, CARECEN San Francisco, and Hondureños contra el SIDA. We also want to say thank you to our partners and friends at Latino Rebels who are also sharing this event through live stream on their Facebook page. And to get us started, we'll first introduce our guests and a little background on who they are. First, one of our panelists for today is Iliana Monterroso of Guatemala. Iliana is a scientist with the Center for International Forestry Research, CIFOR. Iliana is the co-coordinator of Gender and Social Inclusion Research. Her research focuses on gender, tenure, collective rights, environmental governments, and social environmental conflicts, predominantly in Latin America. Iliana has a PhD in environmental sciences. Her postdoctoral research focuses on forest tenure reforms and collective tenure rights in Latin America. Next, we have Susan Kandel, who is going to give us a regional perspective as well as focus on El Salvador. Susan is the Deputy Director and a Senior Researcher of the Salvadoran Research Program on Development and the Environment, PRISMA. She holds an MA in Sustainable Resource Development from UC Berkeley and another master's degree in International Human Rights from the International Institute of Human Rights in France. Her areas of expertise include territorial governance and rural development, climate change and adaptation-based mitigation, migration development, and natural resource management, among other relevant topics. Next, we have Tania Guillén Bolaños of Nicaragua, who will also provide a regional perspective. Tania is Nicaraguan. She is an environmental and equality engineer and a PhD candidate at the University of Hamburg, Germany. Since 2016, she's been part of the technical team of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. She has been following the climate negotiations of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for the last 10 years, where she's been an observer representing civil society organizations from Latin America. She's participated in the preparation of the Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Currently, she's a doctoral researcher at the Climate Service Center, Germany. And finally, we have Adrián Martínez, who's going to provide a regional perspective. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Eastern Finland. He's a master in environmental development and peace specialized in climate policies. He's currently a researcher in climate impacts, loss and damage, human rights, public participation, and international climate law. Adrián is a director of La Ruta del Clima and has been advocating for the UNFCCC Climate Summit since 2014. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and welcome to our conversations on the root causes of migration in Central America, where we'll focus on climate change. I'll first start with a series of questions, and at the end, we'll welcome questions from participants who are here this afternoon. Thank you for being here. So we'll start with our first question. How would you characterize the impact of climate change in Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, particularly in terms of forced displacement, both within the country and immigration? And I'd like to first start with you, Iliana, so you can give us your perspective.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Well, just to share some from our research during the last couple of years in the region, and specifically in Guatemala. You know, the Central American in particular, the Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua have been identified as some of the countries with the highest risk to vulnerability, and this is both related to climate variability, but also food insecurity. So according to the last information that we have in terms of disasters associated with this, with climate variability, and specifically with extreme hydrometeorological events, we know that during the last 20 years, the proportion of events has not only increased, but has also, you know, been worsening in terms of the impacts to the region. We know that the floods and hurricanes, storms are among the ones that cause the largest proportion of deaths and human losses. But we also know that in terms of expansion of droughts, landslides, expansion of the dry corridor, and other specific events like volcanic eruptions, especially in Guatemala, and forest fires account for the loss of almost 40% of the national GDP, specifically only talking about Guatemala in particular. So we know that the events have increased in number and also in terms of the extension of the impacts. We know that these impacts are also exacerbated by the inequality conditions that are found in the country, and that actually make the difference in terms of the capacity to face these impacts and extension towards, you know, like the impacts linked specifically to food security, poverty conditions, inequality in terms of access. These are some of the effects, you know, that are affecting the country and some regions within Guatemala in particular. So I'll leave it there, and then we can continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Iliana. And yes, thank you for expressing how inequalities also exacerbate the effects within Guatemala. Same question, and I want to hand it over to Susan, Susana, so you can give us a perspective on what's going on in El Salvador.
Thanks. I'm going to begin with kind of the overview comments for the region, and probably others will say that, but although the greenhouse gas emissions from all of Central America represent less than 1% of the global emissions, it is one of the most vulnerable regions of the world to the impacts of climate change. And that's tied to a lot of factors. On the one hand, the geographic location of the isthmus, it's between two climatic systems, both the Pacific and the Atlantic, makes Central America particularly vulnerable to climate change. But there's obviously a lot of factors, but as a consequence, for all the region, climate change has unleashed a range of impacts that deepen and exacerbate the historical conditions of socioeconomic exclusion, environmental degradation. And with regards to El Salvador specifically, El Salvador is an unusual place. Okay, for several decades, El Salvador already has been widely known as a case of severe environmental degradation. Unlike the rest of the countries in the region where there are still remaining forests, El Salvador exhausted its agricultural frontier in the middle of last century. And so this severe degradation manifested in deforestation and soil erosion is both one of the causes of its extreme vulnerability to climate change, but also intensifies its impacts. it's kind of a cycle there. This combination, again, magnifies the historical problems of poverty and inclusion. And of course, that impacts the poorest and the most marginalized sectors, rural, women, children. However, it doesn't only affect the livelihoods of the poorest and most vulnerable. Like Iliana was mentioning, it now has an effect on public health. We know that now with the pandemic, public and private infrastructure, food production and security, economic growth, and public finances, among all these different effects. So all of that kind of combines to create a trigger for migration.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us that perspective. And it's interesting to see how things have also been exacerbated, right? You mentioned the pandemic, and I can only imagine how things have worsened for people and forced people out as well due to the natural disasters that you mentioned as well, et cetera. I'll now hand it over to Tania, so you can give us a perspective on the region and Nicaragua as well.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Iliana, Susan, because you already mentioned some of the points that I have noted down, which are, for example, the little contribution of the Central American region to the problem. So we are not originating the problem, but we are being really affected by it. And that's why our priority needs to be to adapt and to protect those vulnerable communities, those impoverished communities around the region. And as you have already mentioned, the scientific community has already highlighted that Central America is the most prominent tropical hotspot in the world, followed by some regions in Asia and other part of the world. And this means that the level or magnitude of change is higher in the climate indices. And that means that at the end, we may also have higher impacts in the different socioeconomic sectors of our economies and society. The IPCC in its last report, because the new one is being prepared. So the last one in 2014 already presented some impacts that we have already observed in the region. And those can be summarized, or among them can be mentioned, for example, the increase of the mean temperature, which we know affects, for example, agricultural sector, the change in the hydrological cycles, which also affects the agriculture, the decline in the forest cover, which different than the case than in Salvador, that due to the degradation, they don't have so much forest anymore. There are other countries in the region like Guatemala, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, they still have a good forest cover, but they are still under process of degradation, sadly. And there are also an increase of vectors of disease. And here we can mention dengue, malaria, and in the last years also chikungunya and Zika. No, I mean, we are living already those changes. And the last one, but not less important, is the decline in the runoff. So available superficial water that is also observed as being reduced, which also affects all the communities and around the region. And those impacts, or effects, sorry for repeating, but impact on the livelihoods of different scales and different magnitudes, but there are some communities on some regions that are especially vulnerable. One of them is being mentioned, for example, the Central American dry corridor that goes from Costa Rica to Guatemala, where we have a lot of agriculture activities and where many cities are located there also. And though all of those generates also higher levels of vulnerability. Then just summarizing at the end, for example, it has been identified in the 1.5 report of the IPCC that in the region we could expect yield reduction related to, for example, maize, rice, wheat, and potential other crops. And also it has been identified that the nutritional factor or value of rice, for example, in other regions of the world, there are studies that says that can be reduced. That could also happen in the region. And that will be a very important thing. It's not only quantity, but it's also about the quality of our food. And then about tropical cyclones, we know that the region was hit last year by the most active season of the records, 2020, even with Corona and everything, we have that record also in the region, where we have, for example, ETA and IOTA, two hurricanes, category 4 and 5, that are affected or impacted almost the same areas within 2 weeks, which means that the governments had very few days in order to prepare between the impact of one hurricane to the next. So these are just examples of how the Central American region is already being affected. And sadly, if climate change or global warming continue, this can be, we can face more dramatic scenarios.
Thank you so much for that, and bringing up, yes, the latest, right, hurricanes that hit the region and devastated it. We'll talk about food security, so I appreciate your comments around the impacts of climate change on agriculture and access to food, the dry corridor you mentioned. Thank you so much for that. And now we'll hand it over to Adrián, so you can give us your perspective. I know you'll be giving a regional perspective on the impacts of climate change.
So after so many comments describing the overall situation of climate impacts, I think from a governance perspective, we had already, our region has already contextual vulnerabilities for climate change. So it's introduced over time. And we're seeing the results. Adaptation limits have been reached in many communities, and this has led to loss and damage. And that's one of the issues that many of our countries, for example, Honduras has tried to raise in the UNFCCC, and which is ignored and does not have an adequate response. And we note that we have limits in terms of our resources, in our institutional capacity to respond to climate change. And we note that we'll have economic and non-economic losses in our territories. And to address that, it's within the Paris Agreement to have an adequate response to it, but we lack funding. There has not been will from the international community to respond adequately to loss and damage and to the human rights conditions that this is generating in our communities, a threat to life, the loss of our infrastructure that sort of bind us into this cycle of rebuilding what we had and going backwards in our development, in our communities, in our countries. And at the end, going back to this idea that many of our communities find themselves in an unjust situation. As our colleagues already mentioned, we're less than 1%. Many of our countries don't even reach a 0.1% of the global emissions. And the responsibility for the impacts that we are finding ourselves to deal with rests upon the most vulnerable populations without resources, without the support of the international community that has supposedly agreed to be responsible and in a differentiated manner for the impacts of climate change, and it's not happening. And it is those people in their houses, in their communities that have to deal with the impacts of climate change alone with no resources. And this sort of breaks the idea that climate action is supposed to base on equity and justice. And it's in this context, in this isolated context, that we find our communities that have not caused climate change in the greatest proportion, having to deal with the impacts of climate change without the support of those who actually caused it.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And I think that, that's a common trend that we're hearing from everyone here, right? That the region represents less than 1% of the global emissions and is suffering some of the greatest impact of climate change. And so thank you, Adrián, for that perspective on right, having to meet this challenge head on, and the support is needed from the international community who's fueling the fossil fuel industry, who's, responsible for tons of this global emissions that are impacting the region. I'll move us on to the next question. And it was brought up by Tania regarding food, agriculture, food security. So the next question for the panelists will be, food insecurity is also an issue of concern in your countries. What is its relationship to climate change? So I'll start again with Iliana, if you want to get us started with that, it'd be great.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, just to give you some recent numbers of what we know, to what extent, what type of problem are we looking at? According to a recent report from the World Food Program and FAO, the region, at least in Guatemala, we have about 4 million people that are being affected by food insecurity. This is a report that was recently launched, and actually the numbers will get worse, especially in the context of ETA and IOTA, the hurricane that hit the region in last November. And I want to use that case in particular as to get the conversation going. In the region, according to the data that we have on the impact that this hurricane had on the region, we know that it affected about 4 million people in Central America. We expect these numbers to rise as the conditions worsens in some of this on the countries. In Guatemala, we had at least about 1.5 million of people that were affected, 11 departments. And whenever we look at the type of effects that this had, the type of activities that it affected, like in addition to the infrastructure and communication infrastructure, we know that the hurricanes had an important impact on agriculture. And from the type of agricultural activities, half of the agricultural lands that were badly hit by the hurricane were subsistence type of agriculture. From that, 40% was under subsistence agriculture. So we know the poor of the poor, the poorest of the poor. And 80% of the agricultural land that was hit by ETA IOTA were maize and beans, which are the basic staples from the region and in particular for Guatemala. So, and I want to talk about a specific case of a community that saw during ETA IOTA the water level go up to 12 meters. That's the case of Kandel. It's a community in the Verapaz region, for those that are acquainted with Guatemala. And, a recent article was talking about that after ETA and IOTA, around 60 people have already migrated only from this community. We're talking about a very small community that was badly hit. And we also saw right after the hurricanes, the migrants caravan, which accounted for almost 8,000 people, mainly coming from Honduras, that were actually stopped and sent back to their home countries in early this year. So we know, like whenever we talk about not only the impact, but also the conditions, in the case of Verapaz, from the national data, we know that 8 out of 10 people are extremely poor. This is the region that has the largest proportion of extreme poor people in the country. And contrastingly, it's also the region where we have 12 out of 34 hydropower projects that provide hydropower not only to Guatemala, but that also allowed, the market with other Central American and also Mexico. But however, 50% of that population, it's without electricity. So here we see the contrast, of a condition that it's already bad, it's gonna get worse, and it has, there's very, we have very few chances to see improvement because of the whole historical process of how that vulnerability has been built over time and how the lack of resilience has actually affected, where it's migration, it's the only option. And when that's, we know migrating is actually very expensive for some of these people. For extremely poor people, actually it's displacement. So you have two options. You either go to the urban areas and you get onto those try to get a new source of livelihood in urban areas, or you either engage in other type of economies. Like these regions in particular are regions where narco traffic and other illicit activities are badly hit in the country. So we see the strategies are very limited in terms of how do we build resilience, or how do we strengthen the loss of resilience in these communities? What type of livelihood options are we providing for these communities, and what type of strategies are there possible in order to rebuild the conditions in the context of a global pandemic? So I mean that's in the case of Guatemala, and this is not a region that is within the dry corridor, although it's where it's expanding. So I leave it there. The scenario is not really good. And you know, like, it's very important to be looking at the strategies and the opportunities here that, you know, the type of attention that needs to be given to these regions. Thank you.
Thank you, Iliana. And I think that too, right? Like you mentioned, like the solution part, right? That we need to pay attention. People are resilient. People are surviving despite the obstacles that you've just talked about. When millions of people are being impacted because their crops were devastated by the last natural disasters that hit the region. So thank you for bringing that perspective to the conversation. Now we'll go to Susan again, and yeah, pose this question to you, right? Food insecurity is also an issue of concern in your countries. What's its relationship to climate change?
Okay, I'll start with, obviously, a lot of what Iliana said fits for the whole region and for El Salvador. Trying to look at it a little bit more specifically and its consequences. In El Salvador, the agricultural sector represents 3/4 of the country's territory or land use. So just getting back to the question that others posed about adaptation and resilience being the most important, one of the things about El Salvador and the region in general is the whole discussion about AFOLU, agriculture and forests and land use, is key. Nature-based solutions or community nature-based solutions is key. A lot different than maybe in developing countries where you're talking about energy, different things. And actually, energy, lots of times, those solutions cause problems because they impose and they continue dispossession of people from territories. So, and even though, like in the case of El Salvador, compared to the other countries, you have a decreasing rural population, the number of agricultural producers is actually increasing. And so I want to point that out. That brings to a point of an increasing dependence on access to land for food security among larger and larger contingents of both urban and rural, marginalized and rural communities to complement their diets with basic foods such as corn and beans. And like they were just mentioned, climate change has severe consequences in the production of food, and it reduces the crop yields, and in that way is threatening food security. It also, the roads. So a few days, and in the case of El Salvador, the whole region is a dry corridor. So a few days without rain in the rainy season, when plants are growing, translating to large losses due to little or no humidity in the soils. And we can go on and on about that. So it's clearly a key trigger. And I guess I want to, kind of building on what Iliana just mentioned, I want to point out that kind of migration obviously is the result of an interlinking crisis in the region. So you have the intensifying climate crisis manifested in large losses from the impact of severe droughts, heavy storms, irregular rainfall, and continued degradation and loss of soil cover. But you also have a governance crisis reflected in increased influence of criminal organizations in the operations of the state and the social political control of large parts of the Northern Triangle. You have a rights crisis reflected in sustained removal of people from their lands and frequent murders of environmental defenders, indigenous Africans and traditional peoples, and a judicial crisis reflected in systematic impunity for these and other crimes. How do you deal with all of that? It's a governance problem in the end. And, you know, I'm just going to add to this that migration adds just another layer to that governance thing. We're talking about the poorest of the poor, as Iliana mentioned, actually can't afford to migrate, don't get remittances, they're outside of it. So you're talking about a further polarization of communities with less land, less money. And if you're about to try to change these conditions of governance, you need social cohesion. And what you're getting is a cycle of just the opposite, you know, of the decomposition. And that's really dangerous, especially when you talk about climate. You need to talk about, if you're talking about restoration or changing that dynamic, you need collective action at group levels. So just to put that out there as part of the discussion.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. I think, you know, those points you made are head on, right? That it's a governance problem that has so much to do with the entire situation, right? And how leadership is playing into helping solve these like existential problems in the region. And now I'll hand it over to Tania, so you can give us your perspective. We'd love to hear.
Yes, and I will also take again some of the points mentioned by Iliana. I mean, one of the important factors here is that agricultural production is or a huge part, a great part of the agricultural production in the region is in the hands of the small scale farmers, which many of them are, as Iliana mentioned, producing for subsistence, and that they are put into extreme scenarios when we have droughts or floods or these extreme hydrological events that we may have in the region. I found a figure from the Central American Development Bank some months ago where it was said that around 40% of the population in the region lives under the line of poverty. And that's it's a shocking figure for me. And for example, in the region, according to also the Central American Bank, they say that around 10%, I mean, having the average around 10% of the regional economy is dependent on climate sensitive sectors, which range from, for example, Nicaragua is the country that is most dependent on it. It was around, if I remember correctly, around 20%, 18%, but Costa Rica, for example, is only dependent on 4.5%. So there you can see that that we have, of course, many aspects that unite us, but also we have very different conditions in some aspects in the region. If we go back to the small scale farmers, we know that they are normally the ones that have less access to any kind of finance or technology that may help them to adapt to the changing conditions. So when there is a drought, there is no one there to help them. They don't have insurance, for example, that one is one of the tools that have been more promoted in the last years or times. So they don't have the means to react, to respond, or to plan either for the future for these changing conditions. They don't have the technology, and then the production is lost. So even if they were producing for self-consumption, then they may face a situation of food insecurity and also insecurity on the nutritional aspect. Together with the farmers, of course, if they don't produce, we don't have in the cities, if we live in the cities, the food, or if we have it, the prices may be higher. And that we have seen that in the region. For example, I remember some years ago here in Nicaragua, due to climate conditions and speculation, the prices of we don't use kilos, but the pound of beans were like really no one could believe how much how expensive beans were in the country. And we eat gallo pinto, so it was a huge impact on the population in general. So we are not talking only about farmers, we are talking about population in general. And then if the land doesn't produce anymore, as we have heard already, and we are every year having the impact of this kind of extreme events, or more frequently, the people at some point, their strategy is to migrate. And there are those that may have more means to migrate in better conditions than others. And we know that those people that are migrating, and that Iliana was mentioning, the caravans going through Guatemala, through Mexico to get into the US, they are not part of these population, part of the people that have the most means to immigrate in better conditions. No, they are facing insecurity, many risks, and they may even face death in the way for having a better life. And for example, in the general overview, because then we talk again, we need to adapt and we to offer options to the people. We need to find alternatives, maybe the diversification of livelihoods and technology, etc. But when we look at the general overview, the global, some figures from the last adaptation gap report says that only 5% of the general climate finance goes to adaptation. And that is also, again, a striking figure for me. And I mean, I cannot, every time when I think about it, it's just shocking. And then it's when we have as a region, again, to say, hey, our priority, because we don't pollute much, we have to look for finance for adapt and to avoid more losses and damages. Because if we go through the finance or the projects that our countries are formulated, many of them are focused on mitigation. And here is not saying mitigation is not important. No, it is. And we can have immediate co-benefits as health issues, etc. But our people is suffering, will be suffering in the long term from more extreme events. So how do we adapt? And here, again, another factor that is important, and my institute is working on it, is the access to robust climate information. How do we know what will happen, right? And just to make a link with migration, and I'm not the expert on migration, but I know that migration is a strategy that we as humans have been using in our history. But again, it's not the same to migrate as myself. For example, I consider myself as a privileged migrant because normally I'm based in Hamburg, because I went there with studies, I went with a scholarship, I am working there, but it's not the same with other people that they don't have even the money to be able to go to the next day, to eat the next day, or in those extreme conditions. So we know climate, it's one of the factors that can affect, but it's together, as already Susan and Iliana mentioned, together with the socioeconomic conditions and this context that is in the region a little bit more complicated, I may say. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania. And wow, that figure that you were talking about, right? The 5%, right? That 5% number really came out to me about resources going into adaptation and how, right, the subsistence farmers are being impacted, but that just trickles down to the whole population, right? When food access, right, is hitting everybody, not just the poor. So thank you so much for that. And Adrián, we'd love to hear your perspective.
So now that Tania is mentioning numbers, I think one that is very sort of to understand the scope of what we're talking about. Biden has just pledged $2 billion, but when we talk about what will happen and the need on loss and damage financing, we're talking about $100 to $200 billion per year to 2030 to deal with loss and damage globally. So that's the amount of issues that we're talking about. And also considering that we're not even at 1.5 is increase of the temperature of the planet yet. So what we'll see on climate impacts will only increase, even if we're successful on the planned climate action under the Paris Agreement. So we're just basically getting started on dealing with climate impacts, dealing with loss and damage. And as our colleagues talked, governance is super important. The governance that implies the participation of those farmers and in their communities, in their governments, to sort of push their governance to focus on climate impacts, to focus on a guided climate action that responds to their context and not necessarily just to the most easily accessible narrative on climate change that might get them funding for certain issues, but to make their politicians, to become those politicians, to make these discussions around the needs of their people and these climate impacts. And this also then sort of, again, with governance, reflects in what Tania mentions on insurance. The proposals that we have from the UNFCCC are completely inadequate. It's telling the most poor people to hire insurance to fight off climate impacts when they're not responsible for it. They're the most vulnerable and they lack resources. And those who cause it don't want to put a penny for it. So it makes completely nonsense and it's basically unjust. So being engaged in politics, being engaged on climate governance itself, is one of the essential means for people that are living in these communities to have a response based on their rights, based on their human dignity. Because currently, if you see it from the international climate regime, the responses that you're getting is no funding to address their needs. And for example, you get the Santiago Network, a place to exchange experiences on loss and damage and climate impacts, but no means for real pragmatic action to support the people that are dealing on their own for this climate action, this climate impacts, which is basically what we have. We have the most vulnerable people, the least responsible ones, taking from their own pocket, dealing with their own resources on the climate impacts that were not generated by their community. So again, the governance side of this discussion is very important to have solutions that fit the context of where people are located.
Thanks so much, Adrián. And yeah, we definitely agree, right? There needs to be some leadership there in governments. You're saying, right, people, the most vulnerable are already figuring out solutions on their own, but they really need the backing of these governments to support and really meet the challenge that is climate change. Great, thank you everyone. And we have one more question for you all. So as we've been talking about throughout the conversation, there are two main responses to climate change mitigation and adaptation. How is each country responding to climate change? And are those responses adequate to prevent forced displacement or develop long-term solutions? So we'll kick that off with Iliana in Guatemala.
Thank you, Nancy. And I just wanted to go back to some of the questions that I've seen in the chat. Thank you for sharing those, especially one that is linked to the development plans, to the role of multilateral donors. Adrián already mentioned something about Biden's administration plans for the region, and specifically on the topic of migration and the role of agriculture in this context. And I think it's very important to also look at the context of today. It's not only Earth Day, but it's also, where today it started, the climate summit started, and the climate finance has been one of the hottest topics in the discussion, as Tania raised. Like she already mentioned the differences between the type of climate finance that is going in mitigation, which is more linked to reduction for deforestation and forest deforestation issues, in comparison to adaptation issues that in the region are increasingly, trying to come up, especially with the green climate funds, but not in the same rate as we need them to be. That's one aspect. But the other one is like whenever we look at how this funding actually is expected to trickle down, not only to the governments, but also to the civil society organizations, and actually those that are actually impacted by these vulnerabilities, we see the numbers even going even beyond the 5% that Tania was talking about. So this gives you an idea of the type of, the conditions that we're facing. Also in the context of the current context of the region and how it has been affected, by a specific extreme events, especially coming out from the hurricanes. I think it's very important that all of these, first we need actions from different stakeholders. This is not only the government's responsibility. We have major governance issues, as it has been highlighted. Therefore, it's not enough to leave the task to the government. Civil society, there needs to be mobilization. Susan talked about the importance of collective action in developing these strategies. It's this is something that we need to come together to be able to address the magnitude of the problem. Another important issue is that, as mentioned also by some of your comments and questions, we're not everybody has the same level of vulnerability. There are important social differentiation conditions that actually will imply that some people are actually suffering more in comparison to others. So it's very important that in the development of these strategies, we look at the specific characteristics of those being affected by it. yeah, and which type of organizations, like are actually mobilizing around these specific issues. And, just to say that, like in the context of governance and governance arrangements, it's very important that we look at the rights. Today, there was another event organized by the Land Portal talking about the important role that indigenous peoples have in climate change, in addressing climate change conditions. I think this is very important, and we need to identify, within those groups that are already being affected, within the type of organizations that are engaged in the processes, how do we come up with, like strategies that involve everybody, not only a few, because that also materializes in the way, the governance and the institutional arrangements that are gonna go about to address these issues are actually being discussed. And this implies, like having the capacities. We need to make sure that government and multilateral donors, and within that context, the potential opportunity that the Biden administration has in this context to be able to strengthen the capacities of those that actually need to be in the table discussing, not only because they are closer to the problem, but also because they're actually impacted by them. So, I think it's very important to make this an issue where, different society organizations have a role in it, where we have to strengthen the capacities, not only in terms of how we react, how do we mobilize around it, but also how we influence the governments, especially because we need to be aware of the challenges that our governments are facing in addressing these issues. And I would say, just to close, the importance of starting to look at those participating, as as those with rights, like we're not only at those that need to benefit, that we need to target from our strategies, but also those that have the rights to actually be in the table to discuss these issues, because they are the ones that are suffering the most. So yeah, I would leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Iliana. And I love that you focus on collective action is needed. And it's amazing that all of you are part of those efforts and really having the right people at the table, right? The people who are directly impacted by this threat of the climate crisis. So thank you for that. I'll pass it over now to Susan.
Yeah, a little bit in the line of Iliana, kind of looking at what people are asking, and also to be a little like hopefully a shining light in all this crisis. I'd like to respond a little differently to the question that you posed and talk about the opportunity that arises with the Biden administration's interest, not only in addressing climate change, but also saying dealing with the root causes of the migration from the Northern Triangle, but also the statements coming out of a lot of the Biden administration officials that are recognizing that in the countries of the region, the governments are weak, ineffective, affected by persuasive corruption, and in some areas under the influence of criminal networks. They're recognizing that. That's in a lot of the statements they're making. And the history, past USAID efforts have targeted strengthening and the modernization of the business sector, but that's come with limited success. And they also recognize that economic elites continue to focus on rent-seeking behavior and have shown little real commitment beyond the ability to adapt their discourse to try to get funds, additional funds. So I think, or we think in PRISMA, and actually we're working with others like CIFOR and others here on this, that the Biden presidency opens a really important window of opportunity to comprehensively address the widespread migrant crisis in the border by integrating a realistic climate resilience component into the US strategy of the Northern Triangle. And there's two underlying assumptions here. One, that really, first, civil society in the Northern Triangle is an asset that needs to be fully mobilized and supported to scale up successful climate resilience efforts on the ground. I mean, there actually is, when it comes to adaptation, it's a local process. Resilience is a local process. And retaking what Iliana said, the importance of civil society. We can't count on the government for doing this. We cannot count on the government for doing this. And I can't even say that negotiations at a global level. We really need to mobilize on the bottom level. And if you think about it, there's a lot of cases in the region, even coming from the pandemic, where people are, they're the first responders. The communities are the first responders collectively working to address these issues. And the second assumption here is that the US government isn't any external actor. They really do make a difference. And so they need to seriously engage in supporting local initiatives to address the climate crisis. And they can make a difference because the governments do care, and the private sector do care, and the banks listen, those kind of things. So under these assumptions, we have some specific recommendations for integrating climate resilience as a critical component of the US Northern Triangle strategy as a way to address the root causes of migration from these countries. There's a lot, and it's impacting a lot, but I'll try to get down to 3 big suggestions. 1, support small farmers and local actors in large-scale restoration of degraded agricultural landscapes as a way to promote climate resilience, advance livelihood security, generate massive employment, more diverse and stronger local economies, enhance community engagement, reduce violence, and improve security. And actually, if you look at some of the things that Biden has proposed domestically, he talks about these cores, like, you know, these climate cores. We're talking about the same thing here. 2, support for the forest communities committed to saving the region's remaining forests and combating the climate and governance crisis in the Northern Triangle. Like Iliana mentioned, this is a key foundation for strengthening institutions and democracy. Evidence has shown that supporting resource rights and ensuring benefits from these resources is key for creating local jobs, preventing corruption, and promoting sustainable development. And 3rd, there's a real opportunity for coordinated policy dialogue and assistance by the various agencies of the US government, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank Group as an actionable pillar to this climate resilience, to really include climate resilient considerations in the formulation of public budgets, investment programs, and use it as cross conditionality and things. And this is even particularly more important now because with IOTA, with ETA, with the pandemic, there's this new push for kind of new economic investment in the region, to the economic recovery idea. So a lot of money is going to be turning down, and we need it to be channeled differently. So I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot more to unpack on that question.
Thank you so much, Susan. I think like those 3 like action steps that you mentioned, right? So supporting the small farmers, support the poorest communities, and right, coordinated policy dialogue around, right, with a climate resilience framework. I think those are essential. So thank you for sharing that. I'll hand it over now to Tania for your comments. Regarding the response, like how is Nicaragua and the region responding to climate change, and are these responses adequate to prevent forced displacement?
Yes, before answering the question, I just wanted to take something from what Adrián mentioned before about countries not willing to spend any resource on paying or compensate for the damages that they have caused in other regions of the world. And that is, I mean, last December, we were celebrating the 5 years of the Paris Agreement in Paris. And then, and today we are celebrating the entry into force of the Escazú Agreement, which is a really important tool for the region now. Going back to the Paris Agreement, there we have to be really specific because now after the Paris Agreement, we have 3 approaches on climate change. We have mitigation, adaptation, and the additional one is loss and damage. And as Adrián mentioned before, what we are doing in the terms of the negotiation on loss and damage is really not ambitious. And that is because as part of the COP decisions, it says that compensation cannot be part of the loss and damage discussion of the Paris Agreement. And that is one of the, I think, main, how do you say, of the not positive things of the Paris Agreement, because they already excluded that right to countries that are being affected by climate change already. And there we have to say that talking about governance in the region and the things that we have in common, we have to push for more joint positions, joint work at the Central American level with our governments. We have already the space, there is the Central American integration system, where there is a lot of potential to push for these common and ambitious positions. Then about the Escazú agreement that today is entering into force after, I think, 12 or 14 governments of the region have already agreed or ratified. This agreement is related to transparency in the decision-making process, but also is related to the protection of climate or environmental activists in general, which for the region, again, is really a crucial thing. We know the problems we have. And then when we talk about, going back to your question that I wanted to relate a little bit also about, I'm not sure if Iliana mentioned that it's not a matter only for governments, because the question was directed to what the governments have done. And then I agree totally with Iliana. This is not only a state or government responsibility, is a society or societal challenge that we have to face as a society also. But just to try to give answers to your questions, for example, in Nicaragua, I'm aware that the Technical Agricultural Institute, they are promoting varieties of different plants or our crops like maize, beans, etc. And they have been doing this work for years already. They are not the only ones. That are also international agencies working on that. And these are good efforts, but they may not be ambitious enough, and they may not reach all the populations that need this kind of, the access to this kind of new technology or actions. And for example, I think that besides or together these kind of approaches or looking for new varieties or so, we have to do a lot of more work on capacity building, on having resilient communities, on diversifying the livelihoods, on having access to climate information, and having access to climate finance, as Iliana already mentioned. Like, it's true, like we talk about, for example, in the figure of the 5%, we say 5 of the global finance, but when we go to the analysis of how much of that money is really invested in the territories, is really little money. And that is an issue that has to be tackled. And I think, for example, that is worth also to mention some experiences that are being promoted by non-governmental organizations. For example, in Nicaragua, there is the Centro Humboldt, who they are promoting, I think in the last 10 years, they have promoting the local weather monitoring in order to increase the access to climate information, in order to improve the decision-making process. And they have to work with local farmers or with the farmers directly, for example. And as a conclusion from my side regarding all the discussion and what can be done and so on, I think as Central America, we have a very good set of legislation and regulations, environmental, maybe in the climate aspects, we need to improve a lot, but in environmental legislation, we have a lot of things that can be complementary to the climate action, and we need to try to make them, to implement them, that our governments, our authorities already or really comply with the law that they have approved, and they don't just leave it on paper. Yeah, and for me, the last message will be that there is urgency in the action, and there is also a lot of ambitions that we need to to implement in all the sectors, all the levels of the society, not only government again, but all of the society has to be united in order to try to face the climate challenge and the future challenges that we will be facing, because as Adrián mentioned before, we have not yet achieved with a 1.5 degree, where we already saw some threshold and breaking points. For example, the coral reef could only survive in 10% at 1.5 degree of global warming. So there is a lot of work to do, and that we have to do it in a joint and a united manner.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think like what I'm hearing from everyone, right? It takes climate action. It takes all of us, right? It takes all of our leadership for us to meet the moment. And lastly, with Adrián, if you will give us your perspective as we close out.
Yeah, so maybe just going back to this question of Biden and like, why is that relevant? And I think tying back also to what Tania says, we have to keep in mind that the idea of not providing additional funding to loss and damage is part of the US policy within the climate regime. The idea of blocking any way to get compensation to communities or to talk about liability in terms of loss and damage is US policy historically from the creation of the Paris Agreement. The idea that adaptation comprehends and does not require and comprehends loss and damage, and that loss and damage is not a separate issue, is currently the position of John Kerry in the US, in the Biden administration. So changing those things that affect global politics, that then affect the people in the communities during the hurricanes or suffering salinization or suffering crop loss, that's what we have to do, because those structural obstacles that generate injustice, that only leave then communities with the solution of getting insurance from some company for climate change impacts that is irrational, then it's all connected. The idea that there is no funding is all connected. It is not sort of a random happening of social structures. It's a planned political structure from a international governance perspective. So that's something we have to keep in mind, especially that considering that those that negotiated the current arrangement in the Paris Agreement are the ones that are now negotiating again the solutions, John Kerry and all those people that were also there in the Paris Agreement. So while it's positive that Joe Biden is in the presidency, we still have a big task, at least in climate change, and also applies to our countries in Central America. We do not have a strong regional position on loss and damage to say the truths that we have to say on behalf of the peoples that we represent. That is not there. I've sat in the Warsaw mechanism, that is this place where they lead on climate impacts, and hear the huge silence from the Central American and the Latin American governments on loss and damage when we get no finance, when we get no aggressive responses from the UNFCCC to the challenges we know our people have on the ground. So changing that is also a challenge. And in general, the idea of compensating and just having justice, it's something that we have to keep in mind. So from my perspective, those are key issues that we have to have. And we have a positive international reaction, but again, the main obstacles remain there. People, or not people, countries and private interests want to be responsible in terms of climate impacts, and we have to face that with justice.
Thank you so much, Adrián, and thank you for bringing up that perspective of loss and damage and how there needs to be true leadership there. And part of that justice is for people to get compensated who haven't been the driving force of climate change, but receiving all of the detrimental impacts of the crisis. We're a couple of minutes over, and I want to just thank everyone who joined us, and thank you to the panelists for answering all these amazing questions that are coming in through the chat and multitasking. So I appreciate that. And I guess we can close out now. Happy Earth Day to everyone. Thanks to all of you for all your amazing work that you're leading across the region in Central America. And thanks to the audience for being here. Feliz Día de la Tierra.